Hi, I'm Tembi.
And I'm Zara, and welcome back for another episode of Berthas Legacy Podcast, where we look at the complexities of gender-based violence through a cultural lens. Today, we hope to continue exploring the intersection of culture, tradition, and societal norms through our unique view as Black women. I'm going to start off with a definition of what the United Nations says gender-based violence or violence against women is. It's any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or mental harm or suffering to women, including threats of acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life. And in addition to that, if we're looking at the Council of Europe, they have defined 6 types of gender-based violence: physical violence, verbal violence, psychological violence, sexual, socio-economic, domestic violence or intimate partner relationships, harassment, and sexual harassment.
Thanks for that, Zara. So I want to refer to a post that we have on Facebook, which I recommend our followers to go and check out. There is so much information there regarding to the domain of gender-based and domestic violence. But it says here on this post, traumas we often invalidate are those that do not fit the stereotypical mold of what society deems as severe or legitimate, such as emotional neglect, chronic invalidation, subtle forms of abuse. But we believe that recognizing and validating all forms of trauma, including those that are often invalidated, is crucial for mental health and societal well-being. So on that note, today I'd like us to explore and look at those definitions that seem to be on the fringes, because quite often we don't even know what qualifies as gender-based violence or domestic violence. And especially since we're looking at it through the scope of a cultural lens, there's some things that are acceptable in certain cultures that aren't actually acceptable. And it's not just cultures. I mean, what do they call me? Gen X.
I think we're Gen X.
We're Gen X and Gen Z. And we've got such totally different views. And I think we could learn from each other. I'm going to take my glasses off. I've finished reading now. So I think we can learn from each other as different generations. I think our generation was quite stoic in their approach.
Well, hold on a second. When you say our generation, are you talking about our parents or are you talking about us? Because I think we've already started evolving from what our parents deemed acceptable behavior in certain situations.
So it would be our parents' generation, but it's what we would have then experienced or seen or learned from growing up. Obviously, we deem ourselves young enough to adapt, right?
Sure.
However, there's definitely a disconnect or a gap, I'd say, between Gen X and Gen Z.
Right.
I mean, we went to school at a time when people would compete and it's 1, 2, 3, everybody else is a loser.
How about that?
You don't do that nowadays. Nowadays, everybody participates.
And you get a participation trophy.
That's it. And there's a lot more focus on the individual, which sometimes, to be honest, and I just ask for grace here because I'm going to go there. To be honest, it seems a little bit self-indulgent, overly indulgent. However, I do think that we could learn from that self-care, that self-indulgence that the current generation seem to be so preoccupied with.
Yeah, there's definitely something about them that is not as relatable. And I'm fairly certain our parents probably felt the same about us when we had some notions or ideas that didn't necessarily align with how they were brought up. But I would definitely agree that it seems a little bit too much. There's a lot of TMI, possibly, if we could say that. Now, before we get deeper into it, I have to give our little disclaimer that the views that we're discussing here, they're our own. We don't represent all Black women. We don't represent all Gen Xers either.
Yeah, that's true.
We're just talking about our personal experience. We're just talking about our personal ideas based on the upbringing we've had and the environment that we've been brought up in.
So one of the things I struggled with, and I'm still learning, because we're still evolving, we're still learning our lessons. When I was looking into domestic violence, gender-based violence, especially in a Western setting, and I was looking for information, I'm trying to inform myself about what the landscape is like. And I remember coming across an advert, which was,
I know where you're going.
You know where I'm going with this, where they were trying to illustrate what constitutes abuse, and it was some young lads wolf whistling and making slightly lewd comments to a girl who was passing by, making her feel unsafe.
Right, and by the definition, that would be harassment, potentially even sexual harassment.
Well, this is what I'm saying.
Is it?
It is. So we need to learn.
Right.
But where do we draw the line? Where do we meet?
I think that's a difficult one because there's some things which are a lot easier to call out as an antiquated, not fit for purpose way of handling things. For example, we talked in a previous episode about our aunts, Anatete, when you go to them with your marital problems. Oh, he beat me, he disciplined me. And you got the standard, Shingirira, ndoshnoita varume, which translated means persevere. This is what men do. This is not uncommon. You're not super special just because this has happened to you. This is what marriage is. And therefore, just shut up and bear it, essentially. Lie back and think of England.
Yeah, so this is another problem. Even that wording of disciplined, when you're talking about two adults, that's wrong.
Problematic.
It's very problematic when you are putting your wife on the same level as an infant who needs to be disciplined.
But these are some of the challenges now that we are facing as we are navigating through our own relationships. You know, our parental unit, that's who we know to go to for advice, for guidance. These are the wise folks. This is the role of the aunts and the parentals in our cultures, in our societies. And so when we go to seek counsel and are being told this is normal behavior, then, you know, it is ripe for the perpetuation of gender-based violence and the things that we're trying to combat. So part of the conversation I believe that we need to be having is, you know, one, talking about, well, what does actually constitute gender-based violence? Because I think there are a lot of people in our communities who may not actually understand that they are victims, that they are actually being abused because of this. But it's such a difficult one because, as you said, those definitions, they're not black and white.
They're not. But my challenge, what I'd like to throw out there, especially to the older generation, maybe those even who are older than us, who would be our parents, is we have to consider our behaviors. So what a lot of the older generation thought was a sacrifice that would benefit their children, of just grinning and bearing it for the sake of keeping the family unit together, actually turned into like a poison chalice, because those children who grow up seeing that then decide later on in life, what's the point of getting married if all I can expect is abuse, you know, struggle, love? Who wants to be part of that?
Right.
And they don't want that. So far from the intended outcome of, oh, I'm doing it for the kids, I'm staying for the children because, you know, I want the children to have an intact family, without really facing the poisonous messages that it sends out, and without standing your ground so that you have you're giving a better example of what a union can be, or what an individual woman should accept or tolerate. You're doing actually the opposite.
And so the extreme is you then have children who don't respect mom because she didn't stand up for herself, who don't respect dad because
He was a bully.
he was an abusive jerk, and
who don't want to get married because they don't see the value in the family unit.
Right, because what did I gain? I basically lived through trauma. You mom and dad are responsible.
And on top of that, now they don't want to have children either, because children are an added, expense, and it's just drama.
Yeah.
And what happens to humanity?
Yeah. So I have to ask the question. I don't know. Was there value in sacrificing self for the greater good? Because it's a slippery slope when we talk about any relationship is compromise.
It is.
And I've heard it said that a good compromise is where both parties are just a little bit unhappy. So there is an element of things that you will accept from your partner for the greater good of the whole. Because we are socialized. Well, speaking for Gen X here, because as you said, Gen Z have a totally different...
And they do what they do. They won't be told.
For Gen X, even though I'm a modern woman, and even though I don't think I need to have a relationship, I don't need to have that S, I don't need to be a Mrs. to be defined, to define me. I am complete. Even within that, there is that yearning. We're relational beings.
We are.
And I do believe that there is that yearning to be part of a unit for a good number of us. Not all of us, but for a good number of us. And so what is acceptable? What are the compromises and the things that you can give up that are acceptable, that don't leave you vulnerable to accepting some forms of abuse by any definition?
It's a difficult one. But definitely, I'd love to see the more conversations being had between the generations, because I do believe there should be a happy medium somewhere where you're not totally self-absorbed. But on the other hand, you're not this martyr.
Right.
There has to be a happy medium that serves everybody.
But you made me this way, Mom. This is your fault.
Oh no, come on, I can't take that.
You brought me into this world. I think we've all had it. But yeah, absolutely. I'd love to see more cultural discussions as well, because we talk about the commonalities within our non-Western cultures, but the degree of acceptability of, still we're talking about that traditional male role in a patriarchal world that gives him license to dictate what goes on in the home, and that being a norm. And so a lot of women, even today, especially today in our communities, in these Western environments, who don't know any different, or who may feel different, but are surrounded by communities that tell them it's not okay for you not to be satisfied with what is a typical practice.
Right.
Where do they go to for assistance, for refuge, for education, for what I found with a lot of folks who have suffered from gender-based violence is needing to connect with others with a lived experience, so that it almost validates your experience, and you know that I'm not alone, and you know what, it's okay for me to talk about this, and I'm not crazy. This actually is not okay. And sometimes just even small interactions like that are enough to light the spark for change for them. And that change doesn't necessarily mean I'm leaving my husband.
No.
It doesn't necessarily mean, that's it, the relationship is over. It may be, I'm going to challenge him in a way that also educates him and has him looking and questioning, and then beginning as well to understand that, you know what, okay, maybe this isn't right. Even if my dad did it, doesn't necessarily mean that I should do it too.
That's true. Yeah. So definitely a lot of room for improvement there from both sides, a bit of give and take. I don't know. What do our viewers think? I'd like to hear what they say in the comments about who's better at dealing with these issues, Gen X or Gen Z, or do you think that there is room for compromise and that the solution lies somewhere in the middle ground?
Yeah, and also how do we begin to have these conversations? How do we start unlearning or questioning, re-evaluating maybe is the better phrase, some of the truths which have been passed down from generation to generation, because what we don't want to do is throw out the baby with the bathwater. I believe there's a lot of richness and value in culture, in who we are, in the practices that have come down from generation to generation that differentiate us from each other. Some of it unifies us, but differentiates because we all want to belong.
That's true. And it's funny that you say that, because that makes me think about, you talk about cultural practices which are good or bad. And I remember once watching, I remember the name of the reporter, an English reporter, I think her name was Emma Heard, who'd gone to South Africa. Mm-hmm. And she was commenting on our practice of lobola, which is the bridal price. Right. Again, when you talk about bridal price, already you're commercializing it and you're looking at it through a Western lens.
Right.
Where when I heard it described, I thought, wow, is that what we did? Because she said the fathers would exchange cattle for their daughters. And it sounded like a very commercial practice of like, okay, you want to buy my daughter, it's going to cost you so many cows. I mean, my husband paid Rora for me.
Right.
Yeah. And it's not something that I thought was primitive.
Sure.
Because the way we've always understood it, it's about a man being able to prove to his in-laws that he can look after the daughter. And it's meant as a token. And don't get me wrong, it has been abused and it is abused sometimes.
Oh my goodness,
right? But quite often, a practice like that, in the wrong hands, can be used as justification for treating a woman as a piece of property. I bought you, so you will. And if you don't, there are consequences. So, that's one of the things that, it's a cultural practice. I believe it's got value. I think it's a nice way of separating us from other people and their practices.
Right.
And it's something that can be admired. Every culture has its own practices that people can look at and admire or comment on.
Sure. And I think there's definitely a beauty in, it's a token of appreciation. Hey, you've given me this gift. You've raised this lovely young woman who's now going to leave your family and join mine. So here's a token of my appreciation as well for you doing that for me. I think in its original intent, there's actually nothing wrong with the practice.
Again, that could just be us being delusional, as we have been known to be.
But absolutely, as with anything, things can be taken out of context and lose their value.
Yeah.
And then instead of being, something good, it's a rod that you're using to beat somebody else into submission with, which I don't believe was the original intent.
The other thing, and I'm not going to comment too heavily on it because I know it's not my culture, but it's something that I've learned, because I remember growing up in Zimbabwe, it was predominantly Christian. Mm-hmm. We didn't have a lot of exposure to the Muslim community. Right. It's only when I came to the UK and I started making Muslim friends. I was, how old? I was a grown woman when for the first time I worked with another lady. I think I must have been about maybe 20s. And she was explaining to me how the hijab is actually a thing of honor.
Right.
Right. It's something that is held sacred.
Yes.
And again, I'm not claiming to be an expert on this, but I got a newfound respect and appreciation for it, because my first knowledge of the hijab was, I don't know what magazine I was reading, and it was a young girl who'd been married off at 10 years old. Mm-hmm. And it was a Western publication, and it was seen through that lens of it being used as a tool of beating someone into submission.
Right. This is my stuff. Don't show it to anybody else.
Yeah. So again, I hopefully at some time we'll get somebody else from that community or from that culture to talk about it.
Right.
But it was only after learning for myself and actually speaking to someone that I thought, actually, no, it's something to be admired, and it's something that they hold in high esteem. So people need to be telling their stories and deciding what works for them and what doesn't.
Yeah, we really are. We have a lot of prejudices that we don't realize, I think, that we hold, and we make a lot of these snap judgments based on our limited exposure to the world. But this is why I'd like to continue spaces like this and discussions like this where we can come together and in future episodes, hopefully educate each other on, what our cultures and customs are, clear up some misconceptions. And again, in the context of gender-based violence, understand maybe how some of the cultural aspects that form our value system may be counterproductive to
progress,
to progress and to gender equality.
Yeah, I think we're going to wrap this up. Yeah, that seems like a pretty good place to wrap it up. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next episode.
Thank you. Don't forget to look at our socials, follow us on Facebook,
like,
Instagram.
Share, subscribe.
Okay.
Right.